The great hull of the Imperial Navy glittered like a palace of stars. Chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, glowing like captured suns. Long tables stretched across the floor, covered in silver plates and crystal glasses. The sound of alien voices echoed everywhere. Laughter, whispers, and sharp tones filled the air. It was the night of the Grand Ball, a gathering where admirals, nobles, and heroes of the Empire came together. Every guest wore fine clothes, armor polished until it shone, and gowns made from silk that shimmered like starlight. This was not a place for common workers. It was a place for the most respected and the most powerful. And yet, among them sat Thomas Hale. Thomas was not an officer. He was not a soldier. He was not even part of the nobility. He was a mechanic. A human mechanic, with rough hands and a simple uniform. The fabric on his jacket was plain, the edges already worn from daily use. His face was honest, sun-browned, and his hair was trimmed only enough to stay out of his eyes. He looked completely out of place among the shining figures at the table. But beside him sat Commander Illyra Vera. Illyra was one of the most admired officers in the fleet. Her silver skin reflected the warm lights of the hall, her tall frame carried the dignity of a warrior, and her eyes sharp and bright seemed to watch everything around her. She had fought in battles that turned the tide of wars. She had stood where others would not dare, and lived to tell the tale. Many in the room respected her. Many more envied her. And she had brought a human mechanic as her guest. The whispers began the moment they entered the hall. The nobles tilted their heads and whispered behind jeweled hands. The younger officers covered their laughter with their glasses. Even the servants looked twice, their eyes flickering between the decorated commander and the man she had chosen to walk beside. A mechanic, one voice murmured. With her, another asked, disbelief heavy in the tone. Humans, always trying to climb where they don't belong. Thomas heard every word. He tried to keep his head straight, tried to walk with steady steps, but his stomach felt like it was twisting. This was not his world. He belonged in the hangars, crawling through engine bays, covered in oil and grease. He belonged with tools in his hand, not a crystal glass. But then he felt her hand. Illyra's hand was warm, steady, and firm in his. She walked tall, her chin high, as if daring anyone to speak against her choice. She did not care for the whispers. She did not care for the laughter. She had chosen Thomas, and that was enough for her. They sat at the table, and the meal began. Strange dishes filled the plates, food that shimmered with colors Thomas had never seen, spices that filled the air with sharp, burning scents. He tried to eat carefully, afraid of spilling, afraid of doing something wrong. His hand trembled once when he lifted the crystal glass, and he could feel eyes on him even then. Then came the first voice. Across the table, an officer with broad shoulders and shining tusks leaned forward. His uniform was heavy with metals, and his smile was sharp as a blade. So, human, the officer said loudly, making sure everyone nearby could hear. Tell us, what is it like fixing pipes while real warriors win battles? The table erupted in laughter. Some officers laughed openly, pounding their fists on the table. Others laughed softly, behind hands or glasses, but they laughed all the same. Even some of the young cadets at the far end of the hall chuckled at the insult. Thomas froze. His ears grew hot, his hands stiff. He wanted to vanish, to sink into the floor and disappear. His throat closed, and words refused to come. But then, Illyra squeezed his hand again. Her eyes burned with anger, but she did not speak. She was waiting. Waiting for him. Thomas swallowed hard. He looked at the officer, then at the rows of laughing faces around him. He forced his voice to stay steady. I don't know what it's like to be a warrior, he said. His words were simple, but they carried across the table. I'm not one. I just fix the ships you break. The laughter faltered for a moment. Illyra's lips twitched, almost into a smile. Thomas continued. When your cannons misfire, when your shields collapse, when your engines sputter, who puts them back together? Not admirals. Not nobles. Mechanics. For a second, silence stretched across the table. A heavy silence, where every ear caught his words. Then the laughter returned sharper, crueler. The officer leaned back in his chair, smirking. So you admit it, the officer said. You're nothing without us. And we are everything without you. The laughter rose again. Thomas's chest burned. He clenched his fists under the table, holding back the anger. The heat of humiliation pressed down on him like a weight. Around him, the nobles smirked, the officers sneered, and the cadets grinned. He felt smaller than he had ever felt in his life. Illyra's jaw was tight. Her eyes were furious. She was about to rise and speak, but then a new voice cut through the noise. Enough. It was not loud. It was not shouted. But the word carried like thunder. Every head in the hall turned. At the far end of the table, Admiral Regar, the oldest living commander of the fleet, was standing. His presence filled the room. His voice, deep and heavy, left no space for laughter. And with that single word, the entire hall fell silent. The single word rang out like thunder. Enough. Every voice in the grand hall fell silent. Every laugh froze. The chandeliers seemed dimmer, the air heavier, as Admiral Regar rose from his place at the head table. He was old, older than most remembered, his armor scratched from wars long past, his presence filling the hall more than any torch or light could. His eyes, sharp and ancient, swept across the room until they landed on Thomas. The Admiral stepped forward, boots echoing on the polished floor. Do you fools hear yourselves? His voice carried across the chamber, slow, heavy, and full of authority. You mock the one who keeps your ships alive? You laugh at the hands that make it possible for you to return from battle? Without men like him, there is no victory. Without mechanics, there is no fleet. No one dared to answer. The tusked officer who had started the laughter sat stiff, his smirk gone. Even the nobles on the higher balconies lowered their eyes. Regar stopped beside Thomas. For a heartbeat, Thomas couldn't move. His chest felt tight, his palms were sweaty, and he couldn't decide if he wanted to shrink or stand. Then a heavy clawed hand rested on his shoulder, firm and steady. This human, Regar declared, his gaze sweeping the room, has more honor in his grease-stained hands than many of you have in all your polished armor. Gasps spread through the hall. Officers who had laughed shifted uneasily, cadets stared wide-eyed, and the proud nobles whispered behind jeweled hands. Thomas sat frozen, stunned by the weight of the Admiral's words. The old commander raised his glass, his voice deep and commanding. To the mechanic. At first, silence. Then, one by one, glasses lifted. Some reluctantly, some with sincerity, but all followed the Admiral's lead. To the mechanic, voices echoed, filling the chamber. The sound of crystal striking crystal spread like ripples across a still pond. Thomas's hand trembled as he lifted his own glass. His heart pounded, his throat tight. He wasn't sure whether to feel proud or overwhelmed, but Illyra leaned closer, her silver eyes soft with pride. I told you, she whispered, they would see. Across the table, the tusked officer clenched his jaw. His humiliation was complete. What had begun as a simple insult had turned into a moment that would be remembered across the fleet. He lowered his head, but Thomas saw the fire still burning in his eyes. That kind of pride did not forgive easily. The music started again, quieter now, as the orchestra sought to return normalcy to the room. Plates were refilled, conversations resumed, but the tone had shifted. No one mocked the mechanic anymore. The whispers were different, cautious, respectful. Thomas remained quiet for the rest of the evening, answering softly when spoken to, keeping his hands steady on the table. He felt smaller than ever under the eyes of so many, yet larger too, as if something inside him had changed. When the ball finally ended and the guests began to leave, Thomas walked beside Illyra through the tall crystal doors. The night air was cooler, the stars above shining sharp and clear. For the first time in his life, he felt taller, though nothing about his body had changed. The Admiral's words replayed in his mind. More honor in his hands than in their armor. He had not asked for those words. He had not earned medals or titles. But they had been given to him nonetheless, and now they weighed on him heavier than steel. As he walked with Illyra back toward the docking bay, he realized something else. Respect could be given in a single moment, but it could also be taken away just as quickly. Tonight he had been defended. Tomorrow, he would have to live up to it. He glanced at Illyra. She was watching him with quiet satisfaction, her chin high, her step steady. She had believed in him when no one else had. She had seen him when everyone else had looked away. That thought steadied him more than anything the Admiral had said. The night was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The next morning, the story of the Grand Ball was already spreading through the fleet. Word traveled fast among soldiers and faster still among mechanics, technicians, and pilots. The tale changed slightly with every telling, but one thing stayed the same: the Admiral had stood up for a human mechanic. Thomas Hale walked into the hangar bays as he always did, but the air felt different. Usually, he was greeted with nods or quick waves, nothing more. Today, eyes followed him. Some saluted, not mockingly, but with a quiet kind of respect. Others stepped aside when he passed, giving him space they had never given before. He didn't know how to feel. Part of him wanted to shrink back into the shadows, to return to the familiar silence of his tools and machines. But another part of him, a part that had been quiet for years, lifted its head. Maybe, just maybe, he belonged here more than he thought. At lunch, he sat down at one of the long metal tables in the mess hall. Normally, he would eat alone or with the other mechanics. But this time, two pilots joined him without hesitation. They did not say much, just simple greetings, but their presence was enough. It was a small sign that the whispers of last night had changed the way people looked at him. Still, not everyone approved. Some officers walked past him with cold eyes, their jaws tight, refusing to acknowledge him at all. Thomas understood. Respect was not given so easily in this fleet. It had to be fought for, earned over years, and even then, many never received it. He had been given something rare, and rare things often breed envy. Commander Illyra visited him later that day. She found him lying half inside an engine, his hands black with grease. She leaned against the frame and smiled faintly. "You've become famous overnight," she teased. Thomas pulled himself out from under the machine, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Famous for being the Admiral's example," he muttered. Her silver eyes softened. "No. Famous because you showed them you could speak the truth in front of all of them. That takes more courage than most officers here will ever have." He shook his head, embarrassed, but her words stayed with him. That evening, Thomas returned to his quarters. The space was small, just a narrow bunk, a desk, and a locker filled with tools. It had always felt like a cage, a place where he ended the day tired and unseen. But now, sitting on the edge of his bed, he felt something different. The Admiral's hand on his shoulder came back to him, heavy and steady. The toast echoed in his ears, to the mechanic. He closed his eyes. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe he was more than just a background worker. He had worth beyond his tools. He mattered. But as quickly as hope came, so did fear. He knew the fleet was not a gentle place. Admiration could turn to scorn just as quickly. Respect could fade if not proven again and again. And enemies he had likely made some last night. The officer with the tusks had not forgotten. Thomas had seen the look in his eyes as the hull toasted. Humiliation was not easily forgiven. Days passed. The fleet carried on with its duties. Repairs were needed, engines demanded care, and Thomas returned to his work. Yet everywhere he went, people remembered. Some treated him with admiration, others with jealousy, but no one ignored him anymore. One night, as he worked alone in the hangar, Illyra came again. She stood watching him for a long moment before speaking. "You understand what happened, don't you?" she asked quietly. He looked up, confused. "The Admiral didn't just defend you," she said. "He reminded them what they've forgotten. That this fleet does not survive on warriors alone. It survives because of people like you. And because of that, you've become a symbol." Thomas frowned. "A symbol? I don't want to be that. I just want to do my job." Her lips curved into a small smile. "Symbols don't choose to be symbols. People make them so. And now, whether you like it or not, they'll be watching you." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't ask for any of this." "No," she said. "But you earned it. There's a difference." He didn't know how to reply, so he simply nodded and returned to his work. But her words lingered. A symbol? Was that really what he had become? Later that night, Thomas lay awake in his bunk. He stared at the ceiling, the low hum of the ship surrounding him. He thought of the Admiral's words, of Illyra's steady gaze, of the way the hull had raised their glasses. And then he thought of the officer who had mocked him, and the cold faces of those who still resented him. He knew the path ahead would not be easy. Respect had been given once, but now it had to be defended. The mechanic who had walked into the ball feeling small was gone. In his place stood someone new. Someone who would have to decide what kind of man he wanted to be, now that the eyes of the fleet were upon him. For Thomas Hale, the simple human mechanic, life would never be the same again. Trouble never sleeps long in the fleet. Respect had been given to Thomas once, but not everyone was willing to keep it alive. In the shadows of the hangars and the silence of officer meetings, whispers began again, not mocking this time, but bitter, sharp, and dangerous. The broad-shouldered officer with the tusks had not forgotten his humiliation. His name was Vorn Karek, a decorated veteran with years of battle under his belt. He had always been proud, too proud, and what happened at the Grand Ball had cut deep into his pride. Being corrected by the Admiral was bad enough, but being corrected in front of the entire command and because of a mechanic, that was a wound he could not forgive. He began to speak quietly to others who disliked what had happened. Officers who resented that a human, an outsider, had received the Admiral's praise. Some felt threatened, others insulted, but together they shared the same thought: Thomas Hale had to be put back in his place. Thomas, meanwhile, worked as he always had. He spent his days crawling through engine bays, welding broken plates, tuning systems no one else wanted to touch. But the stairs had changed. Where once there was simple curiosity, now there was weight. Every mistake, every pause, every breath seemed to draw eyes. He could feel the pressure building. Illyra noticed it too. She stayed close when she could, speaking with him often, reminding him he was not alone. But she also knew the fleet well enough to see the signs. Resentment was growing. And resentment had teeth. One evening, Thomas was called to inspect a damaged shuttle. The request had come from Karek himself. The officer stood nearby as Thomas worked, arms folded across his chest, tusked grin sharp and unfriendly. "You fixed the Admiral's ships, yes?" Karek said casually. "Let's see if you can handle something simple." Thomas said nothing, focusing on the shuttle's damaged engine. He ran his hands over the plating, checking the seals, tracing the power lines. But something felt wrong. The power conduits had been tampered with. Sloppily. Intentionally. He froze, realizing what had been done. The next time the shuttle powered up, the lines would overload, causing a small explosion. Not large enough to destroy the ship, but enough to harm anyone inside. And worse enough to make the mechanic look incompetent. Correct stepped closer. Well, human. Is it too much for you? Thomas kept his voice calm. The conduits are damaged. This shuttle should be grounded until the parts are replaced. Correct's grin widened. Damaged? No, no, they look fine to me. Perhaps you're simply not as skilled as the Admiral believes? The trap was clear now. If Thomas refused to sign off on the repair, he would look weak. If he did sign, and the shuttle failed, he would look incompetent. Either way, Correct won. Thomas's hands tightened into fists. He felt the heat of anger in his chest. But he forced himself to breathe, to stay steady. He wasn't here to win games of pride. He was here to keep people alive. I'll replace the conduits, Thomas said firmly. And I'll report the damage. That way, if it happens again, we'll know it wasn't an accident. Correct's smirk faded slightly, but he said nothing. He turned and walked away, his heavy steps echoing on the hangar floor. Thomas exhaled slowly, then went to work. By the time the shuttle was repaired, word had already spread. Some said Thomas had refused a simple fix. Others whispered that he had covered for his own mistake. The truth that someone had sabotaged the shuttle was harder for them to believe. When Illyria heard what happened, she confronted him in his quarters. Her eyes burned with anger. He's trying to trap you, she said. Correct won't stop. You humiliated him without meaning to. Now he'll do anything to make you fall. Thomas sat on the edge of his bed, tired and heavy with thought. Then I'll just have to be better than him. Every time. Every day. Her expression softened, but her worry didn't fade. That's not fair, she whispered. No, he said quietly. But it's the truth. The days that followed grew harder. More officers tested him, throwing small challenges his way, each one designed to make him stumble. A misplaced tool here, a late report there, a broken part left waiting longer than it should. Nothing he couldn't fix, but enough to wear him down. Yet through it all, Thomas kept working. He refused to bend. He refused to give them the failure they wanted. And the more he endured, the more the ordinary soldiers and mechanics began to respect him. They saw the pressure he was under, the traps laid at his feet, and they saw how he stood tall anyway. For every enemy Thomas gained among the officers, he gained 2 allies among the crew. Still, the storm was not over. Correct was not finished. The officer had tasted humiliation once, and he would not rest until he returned it with interest. And Thomas knew it. As he lay in his bunk at night, staring at the ceiling, the Admiral's words still echoed in his mind. More honor in his hands than in their armor. Honor was one thing. Survival was another. He clenched his fists and whispered to the quiet dark, I'll be ready. The tension in the fleet grew heavier with each passing day. Thomas Hale worked quietly, as he always had, but he could feel eyes on him wherever he went. Some eyes carried respect, others carried envy, and a few carried something colder. Among those coldest eyes were the ones belonging to Vorn Correct. Correct was patient in his anger. He had been embarrassed in front of the fleet and corrected by the Admiral himself. A proud warrior could not forget such a wound. For him, the humiliation had to be answered. But this time, he would not risk open mockery. This time, he would make certain that Thomas failed where no defense could protect him. The chance came sooner than Thomas expected. A fleet competition was announced, a test of skill, held once every cycle to remind both soldiers and workers that every role mattered. Engineers tested their repairs against time. Pilots raced their ships through training courses. Medics performed speed drills. It was a way to encourage pride in one's work. Normally, mechanics were given simple challenges: repair a small system, recalibrate a device, patch a leak. Quick tasks, enough to show their worth. But this year, the challenge for mechanics was announced as something far more difficult. Each team would be given a derelict shuttle and a strict time limit. Within that time, they had to make the shuttle flight ready, no matter the damage. Thomas heard the announcement in silence. His heart sank. It was not the challenge itself. He had rebuilt worse ships with fewer parts. But the way Carec's tusked grin stretched across the hangar told him everything. This was no ordinary competition. This had been arranged. On the day of the test, the hangar was filled with noise. Officers, nobles, and workers gathered to watch. The competition was always a public event, but this time the crowd was larger than usual. Word had spread. People wanted to see if the human mechanic, the one who had received the Admiral's praise, could prove he was truly worthy of it. Thomas approached his assigned shuttle. The vessel looked worse than the others. Panels were missing, wires were stripped, and the engine core was dangerously unstable. He realized immediately that it had been tampered with. Not only would it be difficult to repair, it was risky. If he rushed, the engine could overload. If he hesitated, he would fail the time limit. Carec stood nearby, arms folded, watching with amusement. He had made certain the human would face a task designed to break him. Illyra was in the crowd too. She caught Thomas's eye and gave him the smallest nod. Her gaze was steady, filled with faith. It gave him the strength to take a slow breath and step forward. The signal was given. The test began. Thomas dropped to his knees beside the shuttle, his hands already pulling tools from his belt. He moved quickly but carefully, tearing out the damaged wiring, replacing cracked seals, and patching torn plating. Sweat ran down his face, his arms ached, but his focus never wavered. The crowd murmured as the minutes passed. Some whispered that he was too slow. Others muttered that he would never finish in time. Carec smirked, certain of his victory. But Thomas did not rush. He knew machines, and he knew that speed without precision would kill the shuttle before it even lifted. He worked with the calm rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, ignoring the whispers, ignoring the clock, ignoring the weight of the crowd. Finally, he reached the engine core. It was the heart of the shuttle, and it was nearly destroyed. A single wrong adjustment would overload the system and end the test in disaster. His hands trembled for a moment. He closed his eyes, steadying himself, remembering the Admiral's words, more honor in his hands than in their armor. Then he went to work. The hangar fell silent as sparks flew. Thomas's hands moved fast, connecting conduits, sealing cracks, feeding power lines one by one. The last seconds ticked away, the warning bell echoing through the chamber. And then, with a roar, the engine came to life. The shuttle's lights flickered on, the hum of power filling the hangar. The ship lifted gently off the ground, balanced and steady. The crowd erupted. Some gasped in disbelief, others cheered, but all eyes were on Thomas. He stepped back, chest heaving, sweat dripping down his brow, but his face calm. Carec's smile was gone. His jaw was tight, his eyes burning with quiet rage. His trap had failed. The judges announced the result. Thomas's shuttle was not only operational but had passed the safety checks flawlessly. Against sabotage, against time, against pressure, the human mechanic had succeeded. Illyra's voice rang out from the crowd, clear and proud. "That's my mechanic." Applause spread, first from the workers and pilots, then from some officers as well. It rolled through the hangar like a wave, and for a moment, Thomas felt the weight of pride settle into his chest. Carec turned sharply and left, his heavy boots striking the floor. He would not forget this defeat. But neither would anyone forget what they had just witnessed. That night, As Thomas lay in his bunk, exhaustion pulling at him, he realized something important. He had not just survived a trap. He had proved himself in front of the fleet, not through words or the Admiral's protection, but through his own skill. And skill could not be mocked away. The fleet never stayed quiet for long. Ships moved, patrols rotated, and battles brewed at the edges of Empire space. But beneath the normal rhythm of duty, a quieter storm was forming. Carec's anger did not fade after the competition. If anything, the defeat only sharpened it. Thomas had walked away victorious, and worse, he had done it in front of everyone. Mechanics, soldiers, even young cadets whispered his name with respect. Carec heard those whispers, and each one felt like a blade pressing deeper into his pride. He could not allow it to continue. Not after the ball, not after the Admiral's defense, and not after the test. To him, Thomas was no longer just a mechanic. He was a threat. Thomas, for his part, tried to ignore it. He returned to his work as always, crawling under engines, patching shields, adjusting systems others overlooked. He still felt the stares, still heard the whispers, but he kept his head down. He told himself he didn't need their approval. He only needed to do his job. Yet even as he worked, he knew Carec wasn't finished. The officer's silence was too sharp, his absence too loud. Something was coming. The first sign appeared one night when Thomas returned to his quarters. His locker had been forced open. Tools were missing, and what remained had been tampered with, handles loosened, blades dulled, circuits damaged. Someone wanted him to fail. The next day, while repairing a fighter, one of his wrenches snapped in his hand. The broken edge cut his palm, blood dripping onto the metal. He stared at it for a moment, then wrapped it quickly and kept working. He said nothing, but inside, his anger grew. Illyra noticed the change. She found him later, his hands still wrapped in bandages, his face tight with frustration. "He's pushing you," she said softly. "Trying to break you piece by piece." Thomas shook his head. "I can't fight him the way he wants. If I lose my temper, he wins. If I fall behind, he wins. The only way forward is to keep standing." She studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You've learned faster than most officers ever do." Despite her words, Thomas could not shake the weight pressing on him. At night, he dreamed of sabotage, of broken ships, of explosions he could not stop. The pressure grew heavier with every sunrise. The real strike came during a mission. A small patrol was assigned to escort supply ships across a border region. It was meant to be routine. Thomas was brought along as part of the repair crew, ready to respond if any ships failed. Illyra was there too, piloting one of the escorts. The first half of the journey was quiet. The stars drifted by, the supply ship steady in formation. Thomas sat strapped into his seat, watching the systems hum, his hands resting uneasily on his lap. Then alarms screamed. An engine on one of the supply ships failed suddenly, sending the vessel spinning out of formation. Power surged wildly, threatening to overload the ship's reactor. Thomas jumped up, heart pounding. He knew the signs. The system hadn't just failed, it had been tampered with. This wasn't an accident. Within moments, he was inside the failing ship, racing through smoke and flashing lights. The crew shouted, panicked, as sparks rained from broken conduits. The air smelled of burning wires. He tore open a panel, his hands moving fast despite the chaos. The wiring was cut and reconnected in a way that would guarantee overload. Carec's work. It had his pride written all over it. Thomas grabbed tools from his belt, ignoring the pain in his injured palm. He worked furiously, rerouting power, stabilizing circuits, sealing off damaged lines. His heart hammered in his chest, the sound of the reactor growing louder, deeper, like a beast ready to explode. Minutes felt like hours. Sweat ran into his eyes. His muscles screamed. But at the final moment, with one last connection, the reactor's roar softened. The alarm slowed. The ship steadied. The danger had passed. The crew stared at him in shock and relief. One of them whispered, "He saved us." Back on the escort ship, Illyra's voice came through the comms, steady and proud. "That's my mechanic." The words carried strength, but Thomas knew this was no victory. He had saved the ship, yes. But Correct's trap had been more than sabotage. It had been an attack, one that could have killed dozens. When Thomas returned to his quarters that night, he sat on his bunk, exhausted. His tools were scattered, his bandages dark with grease and blood. He whispered to the quiet room, "This isn't just about pride anymore. He's trying to kill me." The thought burned cold in his chest. For the first time, Thomas realized the fight was no longer about respect. It was about survival. And if he wanted to survive, he would need more than skill with machines. He would need allies. He would need to be ready for a war he had never asked to fight. The supply ship incident changed everything. News spread quickly across the fleet. People whispered that Thomas had saved the crew from certain death, that he had stopped a reactor meltdown with his bare hands. Some added details that grew wilder with each telling, but the core of the story remained the same: the human mechanic had risked his life to protect others. Among the workers and mechanics, he became something close to a hero. When he walked through the hangars, men and women nodded to him with genuine respect. Some even clapped him on the shoulder, thanking him quietly for showing that people like them could matter just as much as soldiers. But the officers were divided. Some respected him for his courage. Others, like Correct, grew colder. To them, every story that lifted Thomas higher was another insult, another reminder that a human and a mechanic was being praised while they were ignored. Thomas felt the change most in the mess hall. He no longer sat alone. Pilots, technicians, and even young cadets joined him at his table. They asked him about repairs, about machines, even about life as a human. He answered simply, never boasting, but his humility only deepened their respect. One evening, a group of mechanics approached him after dinner. Their uniforms were patched, their hands scarred from years of labor. They stood awkwardly for a moment before their leader spoke. "You've shown them we're not invisible," the man said. "We want you to know, we stand with you." Thomas was taken aback. He had never asked for followers. He had never wanted to be anyone's leader. But looking at their faces, tired, worn, yet filled with hope, he understood. The Admiral's words had started something, but it was his actions that had lit the fire. The lower ranks were rallying around him, whether he wanted it or not. Illyra noticed it too. She pulled him aside one night after a long shift. "You've become more than a mechanic," she said quietly. "They see you as one of their own, but stronger. You give them courage. And courage spreads." Thomas frowned. "I didn't ask for this. I just fix things." She gave a soft smile. "Sometimes fixing people is harder than fixing ships. And without meaning to, that's what you're doing." Her words settled heavy on his chest. He didn't feel like a leader, but he could not deny the truth. People were watching him now. Depending on him. Meanwhile, Correct's bitterness deepened into rage. The failure of his sabotage had made him cautious, but it had not broken him. In private, he began to gather those who shared his hatred. Officers who despised humans, nobles who thought mechanics were beneath them, men who envied the respect Thomas had gained. They met in shadows, speaking in low voices, planning. "He embarrasses us all," Correct growled one night, his tusks glinting in the dim light. "Every story told about him is a story that weakens our honor. The Admiral cannot protect him forever. We must remind the fleet of its order. Of its place." A younger officer shifted uneasily. And how do you plan to do that? He's survived every trap so far. Correct's smile was sharp. Then we stop playing games. If the human wants to act like a soldier, let him face danger like one. In battle, no one questions accidents. The others fell silent. The plan forming in Correct's mind was darker than whispers or sabotage. He meant to turn a mission into a death sentence. Back in the hangars, Thomas worked late into the night. The hum of machines was his only comfort. The sound of tools in his hands steadied him, gave him focus. But even there, alone with the ships, he felt the weight of change pressing in. He was no longer just repairing metal. He was holding together something far more fragile: the trust of those who had chosen to follow him, the hope of workers who wanted to believe they mattered. As he tightened the last bolt on a fighter's engine, he paused and looked at his hands. They were scarred now, marked by burns and cuts, each one a memory of battles fought not with weapons, but with will. He whispered to himself, "I didn't ask for this, but I can't walk away from it either." That night, as he lay in his bunk, he thought of Illyra's steady gaze and the Admiral's heavy hand on his shoulder. He thought of the mechanics who stood with him, and of the crew he had saved. For the first time, he admitted the truth to himself. He was no longer invisible. He had become a symbol not just of skill, but of resistance against those who believed only titles and armor gave worth. And somewhere in the darkness of the ship, Correct sharpened his plan, waiting for the chance to strike again. Thomas did not know when the test would come, or how. But deep down, he felt it growing closer. The storm had not ended. It was only beginning. The fleet was called to the front. Tensions at the Empire's border had boiled into open conflict, and the admirals ordered every ship into position. For many, this was routine, another battle in a long war. But for Thomas, it was something new. He had always worked in the hangars, safe from the fire of combat. Now, he was assigned to ride along with the escorts, ready to repair damage in the middle of battle. He tried to steady himself, telling his mind this was just another job. Machines break, and he fixes them. That was the truth. But as the stars streaked past the window of the escort ship, his stomach twisted. This time, if he failed, people would die. Illyra was calm as ever. She sat at her controls, eyes sharp, her voice steady as she gave orders. When she glanced at him, she gave the faintest smile, a silent promise that she would keep him safe. He nodded back, though fear sat heavy on his chest. The battle came suddenly. Enemy ships burst out of the void, their weapons flashing like suns. The fleet spread into formation, cannons roaring. The sound of impacts shook the escort, alarms blaring. Thomas felt the floor shudder under his boots, the air thick with smoke and sparks. He rushed to the engine bay, his tools clattering at his belt. The ship's power core flickered dangerously, systems overloading from repeated strikes. He dropped to his knees, hands flying over panels, rerouting power lines, sealing ruptures, forcing the engine to stay alive. "Status, mechanic." Illyra's voice came through the COMM. "Engines holding," Thomas shouted back, sweat dripping from his forehead. "But not for long if this keeps up." Outside, the battle raged. Fighters darted like insects, ships clashed, and explosions tore holes in the void. Through the chaos, Thomas fought a quieter battle, one of wires, circuits, and steel. And then it happened. The escort ship shuddered violently, throwing him against the bulkhead. A new alarm screamed, one he had never heard before. He scrambled to the control board, his eyes widening. The coolant system had been deliberately rigged to fail. Not damaged by enemy fire. Rigged. It was correct. Thomas knew it instantly. The officer's sabotage had been waiting, hidden until the right moment. Now, in the middle of battle, it would do what Correct had always wanted, kill Thomas, and make it look like the chaos of war. The power core began to heat, the numbers climbing too fast. If it breached, the entire ship would explode, taking every soul aboard with it. Thomas's heart pounded. His hands moved before his mind could catch up. He tore open the coolant lines, tools flashing in the dim red light. Steam hissed, burning his skin, but he didn't stop. Crew members shouted, panicked, but Thomas ignored them. He rerouted pressure valves, forced a bypass, and shoved his bleeding hand into a burning panel to hold a line steady. Pain shot through him, blinding, but he gritted his teeth and worked. Hold together, he whispered to the machine. Just a little longer. The enemy fire shook the ship again. Sparks rained down. A pipe burst, spraying him with scalding steam. He cried out but didn't let go. Minutes stretched into eternity. His vision blurred, his body screamed, but finally the alarm slowed. The numbers dropped. The power core stabilized. The ship lived. The crew stared at him in stunned silence. One of them finally spoke. He saved us. Illyra's voice came through the comm again, steady but softer this time. That's my mechanic. Thomas slumped against the wall, chest heaving, his burned hand shaking. He wanted nothing more than to close his eyes and rest. But even as relief washed through him, anger burned beneath it. This hadn't been a random failure. This had been a trap. Karek had tried to kill him and nearly taken an entire ship with him. When the battle ended, the fleet limped back into safer space. Cheers rose for the victory, but Thomas sat in silence, bandages wrapped tight around his hands. He was alive, but barely. Illyra visited him in the medbay. She stood by his bed, her eyes sharp with fury. You know who did this, she said. Thomas nodded weakly. Karek. Her jaw tightened. He's gone too far. This isn't just rivalry anymore. This is murder. Thomas looked down at his bandaged hands. His voice was quiet, but steady. Then we have to prove it. Not just for me. For everyone. If he's willing to do this to me, he'll do it to anyone who stands in his way. She placed a hand on his shoulder, gentle but firm. Then we'll find a way. Together. For the first time, Thomas did not feel alone in the fight. He had allies now. He had Illyra. And somewhere deep inside, he found a spark of determination. He had survived Karek's trap once more. But the next time might not leave him standing. The war outside was dangerous, but the war inside the fleet was becoming just as deadly. And Thomas Hale, the human mechanic, had no choice but to fight both. The medbay lights were dim, humming softly in the silence. Thomas lay awake, his burned hands wrapped in bandages, his body aching with every breath. He should have been resting, but his mind refused to quiet. He kept replaying the coolant failure in his head, the snapped lines, the rising heat, the near explosion. It hadn't been random. It hadn't been battle damage. It had been deliberate. Karek. The name burned in his thoughts like fire. The officer had gone from mockery to sabotage to outright murder, and Thomas knew it wouldn't stop here. Unless someone acted, Karek would keep coming until he won. Illyra entered quietly. She moved with the calm strength of a soldier, but her eyes carried something else tonight: anger. She sat beside him, leaning forward. I've spoken with some of the crew, she said. They were in the engine bay with you. They saw enough to know the failure wasn't natural. If we gather their statements, we can build a case. Thomas shook his head weakly. You know how it works. Who will they believe, a human mechanic, or a decorated officer with years of service? Her jaw tightened. They'll believe us if we bring proof. And if they don't, then I'll make them. He studied her for a moment. She wasn't just defending him out of loyalty. There was something deeper, something personal. For Illyra, Karek's arrogance and cruelty were stains on the very honor she fought for. In the days that followed, Whispers spread again through the lower decks. Mechanics, technicians, and ordinary crew members talked in quiet voices about what Thomas had done in battle. He had saved them again, risking his own life to hold the ship together. And many of them knew the truth: the failure had been too strange, too sudden, too perfect to be chance. One by one, they came to him. Men and women with tired faces, grease on their hands, and quiet determination in their eyes. "We've got your back," one said. "He's dangerous. If we stay silent, he'll do worse," another added. "You're not fighting this alone anymore," a third whispered. It wasn't a rebellion, not yet. But it was something close, a quiet unity forming in the shadows, ordinary workers standing together against a powerful officer. Illyra gathered statements, quietly at first, then more boldly. She confronted others who had seen Karek near the ships before missions, asking sharp questions that left them pale and hesitant. Bit by bit, a picture began to form. But Karek was no fool. He sensed the shift, the whispers that no longer favored him. He began to strike back in subtle ways. Orders arrived late or not at all. Supplies went missing from storage. Mechanics who spoke up found themselves reassigned to harsher posts. Fear began to spread again. One night, as Thomas worked late in the hangar, a group of mechanics approached him. Their leader, the same scarred man who had pledged support before, spoke with urgency. "Word is spreading that Karek's planning something bigger. Something public. He wants to break you in front of everyone, so no one will dare stand with you again." Thomas set down his tools, his chest tightening. "Do you know what it is?" "Not yet," the man said. "But it's coming soon. Be ready." Thomas nodded, though his stomach churned. He had fought machines all his life, but fighting men, fighting power and politics was a battle he had never wanted. And yet, he could no longer turn away. Too many people were looking to him now. Illyra found him later, still staring at the half-repaired engine in silence. She touched his shoulder lightly. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said. He looked at her, his voice rough. "But if I fall, they all fall. That's what Karek wants, to make me the example. To remind them that people like me can never rise." Her eyes hardened. "Then we make a different example. One he can't erase." He drew a long breath. Somewhere inside, beneath the fear and doubt, a spark caught fire. He thought of the Admiral's hand on his shoulder. He thought of the workers who had whispered their support. He thought of Illyra's unwavering gaze. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was their symbol, whether he wanted it or not. And symbols had to stand. That night, Thomas lay awake in his bunk, the hum of the ship all around him. He knew Karek's move was coming. Maybe tomorrow, maybe the next battle. But it was close. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself, steadying his breath. "I'm ready." The confrontation came sooner than anyone expected. The fleet gathered for another assembly, this time in the main hall where announcements of honor and discipline were read aloud. Officers stood tall in their gleaming uniforms, nobles watched from the balcony, and workers crowded in the back rows, their plain clothes a reminder of their lower station. Thomas stood with Illyra near the edge of the hall. He didn't want to be there. Crowds still made his stomach twist, and whispers still buzzed whenever he entered. But he had no choice. Karek had chosen this stage. When the Admiral rose to speak, the hall fell silent. His deep voice carried across the chamber, naming victories, praising heroes, and reminding the fleet of its duty. Then, before he could finish, Karek stepped forward. The tusked officer bowed with a show of respect, but his eyes gleamed with something sharper. "Admiral," he said loudly, "with your leave, I must raise a matter of honor." A ripple of unease spread through the hall. Everyone knew what this was about. Karek turned, his gaze locking on Thomas. "This human mechanic," he declared, his voice sharp, has been praised far beyond his worth. He hides behind stories of luck, behind the protection of higher ranks. But I say he is no hero. He is a fraud. And if he claims otherwise, let him prove it before us all. Gasps echoed. Some officers nodded in agreement, others frowned, but no one spoke. All eyes turned to Thomas. Thomas's chest tightened. His first instinct was to step back, to disappear into the crowd. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't a speaker. He was just a mechanic. But then he felt Illyra's hand at his side, steady and strong. Her eyes burned with quiet fire, telling him without words, stand. He drew a slow breath and stepped forward. The hall seemed to hold its breath. I never claimed to be a hero, Thomas said, his voice steady though his heart pounded. I don't wear medals. I don't command fleets. I fix the ships. When they break, I put them back together. That's all I've ever done. Some in the crowd shifted, uneasy. He went on. But you all know this, without the workers, without the mechanics, without the nameless hands keeping your machines alive, you'd never make it home. I don't ask for your honor. I only ask that you remember the truth. And the truth is every victory you claim is built on the backs of those you ignore. Silence followed. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Karek laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the stillness. Fine words, he sneered. But words are easy. Let's see if you can act. He motioned, and guards wheeled in a battered training engine, damaged and unstable. Repair this now, here, in front of the fleet. If you succeed, I will kneel and call you worthy. If you fail, then all will see what you truly are. It was a trap. The engine was worse than broken. Thomas could see it from here. Parts were missing, lines cut deliberately. No one could make it flight ready. Karek meant to crush him, publicly and finally. Thomas stared at it, his mind racing. His hands shook. This wasn't just about machines anymore. This was about his place in the fleet. His very life. Then he remembered the Admiral's words, more honor in his hands than in their armor. He stepped forward. I'll do it. Gasps filled the hall. Karek's grin widened. Thomas knelt by the engine, tools in hand. He knew he couldn't fix everything not the way it was meant to run. But he didn't need perfection. He only needed proof. Proof that skill mattered more than pride. He worked fast, sweat dripping, hands moving with practiced rhythm. Sparks flew, smoke hissed, and his burned palms ached with every turn of the wrench. The crowd leaned in, watching in tense silence. Finally, he stepped back. The engine roared, coughing, sputtering, then steadied into a rough but living hum. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't pretty. But it ran. The hall erupted. Workers and mechanics cheered. Pilots clapped. Even some officers nodded in grudging respect. Karek's face twisted with rage. He had lost again. Before he could speak, Admiral Regar rose. Enough, the Admiral thundered. His gaze swept the hall. You've seen the truth with your own eyes. Skill, courage, and honor are not decided by rank or blood. They are decided by action. And this mechanic has shown more of all three than many who wear fine armor. The Admiral turned to Karek, his voice sharp. And you have shown only arrogance and deceit. You have shamed this fleet. Karek froze, his tusks clenched. Around him, officers looked away, unwilling to support him. His power was gone. The Admiral raised his glass, as he had on that night at the ball. To the mechanic. This time, the hall answered in full. Voices rose together, strong and clear. To the mechanic. Thomas stood in stunned silence, the sound washing over him. Illyra touched his arm, her smile bright and proud. They see you now, she whispered. For the first time, Thomas believed it. He was no longer invisible. No longer just a background worker. He was proof that even the smallest hands could shape the fate of the fleet. And as the cheers echoed through the hall, he lifted his head high. The mechanic had become a legend.